So last week we read these early poems by Mahmoud Darwish, poems for the most part written in the 1960s. And today, the long poem in particular, the Andalusian poem that we read is a much later poem. As the article the very short article, which I hope you got to read, by Edward Said, who's a Palestinian American intellectual. He used to teach at Columbia. There's a biography of him that just came out. It's I think it's actually one of his more elegant essays. It's very short, very nice, very informative about Mahmoud Darwish. As he mentions, it was published in 1992, this 11 Planets poem. And it was published on the occasion of the Madrid conference, which was one of the preparatory steps towards the Oslo Accords, which were signed in 1993, and which Edward Said himself criticized very heavily at the time, basically as he called it a Palestinian Versailles. An instrument of Palestinian surrender is what he called it, because he felt that the Oslo Accords basically formalized the Palestinian liberation, the Palestinian National Authority as a kind of police force in, at the time, the West Bank and Gaza. Now it's not really in Gaza at all, but this was Said's worry. And it seems like a pretty prescient worry, frankly. So it was written on that occasion of the Madrid conference, but also, of course, of the 500th year anniversary of the expulsion of what were called the Moors from Andalusia, from the Iberian Peninsula in 1492. It so happens that 1492, of course, is also the year that Columbus landed in these territories. And there's another long poem which we haven't read, but which would have been interesting, but it's a long poem, which is a kind of pendant poem. So a poem that matches the one that we read, which is actually about the conquest of the New World. So it's a poem that's written from the perspective of a Native American. And Darwish actually did quite a bit of research and listened apparently to Native American music and chanted poetry, and in some ways tried to channel what he heard into that poem. It's been translated. It has this slightly, to our ears, archaic title, I think, of The Last Speech of the Red Indian to the White Man. But that is what it is. It's a monologue of a Native American on the occasion of 1492 as a kind of, as the Moors were being expelled from Andalusia, here is Christopher Columbus landing in the New World. And this is a fictional voice monologue, not exactly welcoming him there, but it's a kind of prophetic presence. I could say a little bit more about that, but that's important to know that there are these two poems about 1492 that he wrote at the same time. So that's the poem that I really want to get to reading. But I thought that I felt like there was a few threads that I left untied at the end of our class on last week, and I thought that I'd try to say a little bit about them. We didn't get to read all the poems that you read for that class, and I just thought I'd say something, I hope, that's kind of helpful in summarizing about what we were saying. My general kind of thought about Darwish and what makes him especially interesting, but also I think typical of Arab poets, modern Arab poets, is that he is a public intellectual, which is not always the way that we think about poets in this country. Which is to say that, like, he's a poet who takes up this burden of articulating the sentiments and thoughts of a collective, of a community. So anger, grief, celebration, love, and this is a burden, really. It's not an easy task to represent a collective. It's not easy to know how you do it. It's not easy, I think, even psychologically, to think that you should be doing it or that you are, legitimate in that sense. And it's a task that clearly blurs the line between poetry and politics in a very uncomfortable way. Is this simply propaganda on behalf of the Palestinian national cause, right? And Darwish, and this is something that he often complained about, this kind of responsibility. I mean, he took the responsibility, he accepted it in some ways, but he also sort of fretted under it a little bit. He recognized that it put certain kinds of restrictions on him. And, he said, one of the things that he worried about most was was being interpreted as like a symbolist poet, an allegorical poet, right? He says, every time I write a poem about my mother, people think I'm talking about Palestine, but sometimes I'm just talking about my mother, right? And he really, this is something that he said. So there's an amusing longer scene from a book called, this is the book, it's called Memory for Forgetfulness. And it's a wonderful prose memoir by Darwish about his experience in Beirut in 1982, from which he, along with the rest of the PLO, was expelled by Israel during Lebanon's civil war. And so this was when they left Beirut, they went to Tunisia. On their way from Beirut, they first stopped in Athens. You read a poem today called Athens Airport, and that's actually the backdrop to that poem, is this stop in Athens, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. But that's where they went. They first went from Beirut basically to Athens and then down to Tunisia. So this scene where he's again worrying about this kind of being labeled as or understood as a symbolist poet, whereas he doesn't want to be it. He wants to just be kind of, he's talking about what he's talking about, right? He's not talking about symbols. He's not talking about allegories. Anyway, I thought that you would enjoy this. So this is at the end of Memory for Forgetfulness, as he's kind of everybody has come down to the sea to look out at the scene of their exile. And he sits next to a young man. And the young man says, "Tell me, Mahmoud, what do you mean by the sea? What is the meaning of the sea in The Sea Is Your Last Chance?" It's a line of poetry that he's quoting. What does that mean? And Darwish says, "Where are you from?" "From Haifa." "You're from Haifa and you don't know the meaning of the sea?" Haifa is a coastal town. "I wasn't born in Haifa. I was born here in the refugee camp." "Still, you were born in the camp, but you don't know the meaning of the sea?" "Yes, I know the sea. What I want to know is, what's the meaning of the sea in poetry?" "The meaning of the sea in poetry is the same as its meaning at the edge of the land." "The sea in poetry is the same as the sea in the sea?" "Yeah, the sea is the sea in poetry, in prose, and at the edge of the land." "Well, but they tell me that you're a symbolist poet, overflowing with symbols. So I thought that your sea was not the same sea we know, a sea other than our sea." No, they were lying to you. My sea is your sea, and your sea is my sea. We came from the same sea, and we are headed to the same sea. The sea is the sea." The fighter is amazed by the poet's inability to explain his poetry. So this is a little comic interlude about not being able to be taken literally because he's a poet, right? So this is like kind of the burden of being a poet, that nobody thinks you're actually just saying what you're saying. And we talked on Wednesday about how lots of Darwish's early poems in particular adopt this kind of stylized simplicity of address. That's the manner of that rural worker in Identity Card, that it's an exaggerated kind of simplicity, precisely in some ways to escape this kind of metaphorical reading. Like, this is simple language. This is not poetry language. This is not romantic poetry, right? This is not the rose of the dictionary. This is the rose of the field. That's what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a real rose, not a merely kind of poetic rose. Now, my own feeling, I should say, is that really actually the excitement of reading Darwish is that the personal and the political or the symbolic, they're always in tension. Said in his essay says that in Darwish, the personal and the public are always in an uneasy relationship. Now, I think that that's what makes him an interesting poet to read, actually, is that you are always tempted with Darwish to add meanings, to think about what the political ramifications might be. Sometimes they might take you to an interesting place if you continue that kind of reading. Sometimes they might not. But Darwish is always kind of, I think that's an interesting temptation for us as readers to have. And I don't think we should actually, or we shouldn't necessarily flee from it, because I think sometimes it does lead to a much richer sense of what these poems are about. So, you know, again, people often talk about, you know, a poem being reduced to its political meanings. I don't think that's possible, of course, but it's my experience, especially reading somebody like Darwish, but I think this is true of most poets. The more you know about the resonances of these words, the more you know about historical and political background of these things, the richer they become, the more interesting they become. So it's not a matter of being reductive, it's a matter of widening one's scope of all the things that a poem could be and all the things that it could say. So I think that one way of thinking about what Darwish's constant preoccupation is in the same way is to answer this question of what makes my particular or peculiar experience bigger than myself? What makes it representative? What legitimates me to speak on behalf of others? Because you have to have a justification for that. And then you have to come up with poetic techniques for conveying it too. But in what way can a poet, Darwish is often called the national poet of Palestine. So what does that mean? How do you do that in poetry? What sort of strategies does one adopt to either claim that identity, or in other cases, actually to nuance it or flee from it in some cases? And what I want to suggest right away is that one of the things that Darwish in his later poetry does time and time again is to that by one of his suggestions is that by casting himself, by making himself into an exile, and that's one of the symbolic meanings of the sea in Darwish, is it's the place of exile, right? The land is where you belong, where you were born. I was born there. I belong there. It's a grounded place. It's a rooted place. And the sea is consistently a kind of space of exile. But he's saying, but I think in the later poetry in particular, which is not always about the sea, but it is often about exile. Certainly that's true of the 1992 poem, the 11 Planet poem, in a way that we can talk about. But that claiming that identity of exile actually is not a narrowing of possibilities. It's a painful experience, to be sure, for him. But poetically speaking, his point over and over again is that it makes him available to all sorts of solidarities with people all over the world who also, for one reason or another, are homeless or displaced or indeed defeated. I want to show a clip. It's a little bit lengthy. It's about 4 minutes, but it's from a wonderful, it's of Darwish speaking. It's from a movie called Notre Musique, which is by the French director Jean-Luc Godard. And Darwish has several kind of cameos in this movie in interesting ways. And this one, he's being interviewed by an Israeli poet. And this is, the words that he says are actually basically taken from a real interview, which was published in Hebrew first and then in Arabic, and has now been published in French translation and English translation in a book called Palestine as Metaphor. So her name is Helet Yeshurun, and she's a poet herself. She's kind of being played by somebody else in this clip. And you'll see in the background, and it's interesting in the context of the movie. In this scene, it's merely a little bit puzzling. There are several Native American characters who are taking camera shots of Darwish. And it's clear that the reasons why they're there have to do with the poems that he was writing in 1992. So I just wanted to show, it's about a 4-minute clip of Darwish talking about being a poet of a defeated people and the opportunities, the kind of counterintuitive opportunities that claiming that mantle offers to him. So here's the clip.
De la terre, de la promesse, et ensuite du pardon. מחמוד דרוויש, כתבת, זה הכופה את ההיסטוריה שלו, יורש את ארץ המילים. האם אתה לא ממעיט בקשר של הישראלים עם האדמה הזו? כשאתה מוסיף שאין מקום למשורר ההומרי, ושאתה מנסה להיות המשורר של טרויה, ושאתה אוהב מובסים, תיזהר, אתה מתחיל להישמע יהודי.
آمن ذلك، فهذا أمر حسن الصيت في هذه الأيام، لكن الحقيقة لها وجهان. لقد استمعنا إلى الرواية الإغريقية، وسمعنا أحيانا صوت الضحية الطروادية على لسان يوريبيدس. أما أنا فإنني أبحث عن شاعر طروادة، لأن طروادة لم تروي حكايته، وأتساءل هل الشعب أو البلد الذي له شعراء كبار يملك الحق في السيطرة على شعب آخر لا شعراء له؟ وهل غياب الشعر عند شعب يشكل سببا كافيا لهزيمته؟ هل الشعر إيماء أم هو أحد أدوات السلطة؟ هل بإمكان شعب أن يكون قويا دون أن يكتب شعرا؟ أنا ابن شعب غير معترف به بما فيه الكفاية حتى الآن، وأريد أن أتكلم باسم الغائب، باسم شاعر طروادة. فإن الوحي الشعري والمشاعر الإنسانية قد تظهر أكبر في الهزيمة مما هي في النصر. في الخسارة أيضا شاعرية عميقة، وقد تكون هناك شاعرية أعمق في الخسارة. ولو كنت أنتمي إلى معسكر المنتصرين لشاركت في مظاهرات التضامن مع الضحايا. هل تعلمين لماذا نحن الفلسطينيين مشهورون؟ لأنكم أنتم أعداؤنا. إن الاهتمام بنا نابع من الاهتمام بالمسألة اليهودية. بك وليس بي أنا. إذن نحن قليلو الحظ في أن تكون إسرائيل هي عدونا، لأنها تحظى بمؤيدين لا حد لهم في العالم، ونحن أيضا محظوظون لأن تكون إسرائيل عدونا، لأن اليهود هم مركز اهتمام العالم. لذلك ألحقتم بنا الهزيمة وأعطيتمونا الشهرة. لقد ألحقتم بنا الهزيمة ولكن منحتمونا الشهرة.
אנחנו שרתם מול השלכם.
نعم، أنتم وزارة دعايتنا، لأن العالم يهتم بكم أكثر مما يهتم بنا، وليست لدي أي أوهام حول هذا الأمر.
So I want to come back to that, to some of the things that were said in that interview a little bit later on. You'll have noticed, I hope, that there are some citations within that interview of what year did that come out? I believe it came out in the late 90s, 1998, maybe 1999. That there are several lines from their الحقيقة لها وجهين, truth has two faces, that actually come from the poem that you read. So I do want to come back to it, but I want to remain, so my point in showing it now is just to say that this question of on whose behalf do you speak, what ways does one become a representative? That one of the ways that he thinks about that certainly has to do with a representative of the defeated, to speak in solidarity with the losers of history. And a paradigmatic example of that is Troy, of course. But the Palestinians themselves also embody that kind of historical experience. So that's one way of thinking about exile, and when we look at the poem, we can kind of complexify it, I think. But let me return to the poems that we read last week again and say that, point out that another way that Darwish thinks about poetry as a representative of a collective, that is to say, what makes my peculiar, particular, singular experience a universal one, maybe even, or a national one, is that in the early poems, interestingly, he creates a kind of chorus, a number of speaking positions. So he writes a number of dramatic monologues, right? So he has a rural worker. He has a guy speaking to an Israeli soldier. And he has that speaker in the letter from exile. None of these are Darwish, right? He's creating a kind of collective by going through certain speaker positions and suggesting that there is a large collective out here, and that, you know, maybe its contours can be sketched by going through a number of speakers. Now, I think it's important to recognize the limitations of this strategy, so to speak, or the one that Darwish proposes. There are no female speakers among Darwish's various dramatic monologues, and that's an important limitation, I think, to keep in mind. But let's just take, since we didn't really look at it, I think it'll be helpful if we think about that letter from exile poem. If you have it, you can look at it. Now, the poem has a very peculiar, as there is a footnote suggests, a very peculiar historical situation or occasion, which is that after the Nakba, after the 1948 loss of historical Palestine, Palestinians, some remained in what is now Israel, some were in the West Bank, some were in what's now the Gaza Strip, and some went to Arab countries, some went to Europe, many went to surrounding Arab countries, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon. And after 1948, the Israeli state set up a radio program on one of the state-funded programs called Rasa'il al-Mustami'in fil Kharij. So letters to listeners abroad. And what this radio program was Israeli Arabs, that is to say, Palestinian Arabs who had remained inside Israel, speaking on the radio to those outside of Israel, maybe in Damascus, maybe in Beirut, maybe in southern Lebanon. And the speaker of that poem is one of those Palestinians who is no longer inside the country. And he's listening to this radio program because it can diffuse, it can disseminate across national borders. That's the whole point of the radio program from the state's point of view. And the speaker, as you'll remember, he's very dissatisfied with what he hears on the radio because everybody keeps saying, "Ana b'khair," I'm fine. They keep saying, "I'm fine, I'm fine, I'm fine." And of course, he knows they're not fine. They're living under occupation. They're living under stresses of various kinds. But then he has the microphone and he's going to sort of send some kind of a letter back. Yeah, the Israeli government, I'm looking at the chat. This was a state radio station. I think it was Channel 4. So it set it up, and then it had Arab participants speak to those outside, basically saying life is fine here. And that's the reason for the poets, the speakers, dissatisfaction, because he doesn't believe what he's hearing on the radio, right? But then he also is going to speak into the radio, and he himself doesn't know what to say. There's a kind of funny thing going on with the conventions of letter writing, because that is what one says in a letter, like, "I'm doing fine, how are you?" These kinds of things. And he kind of doesn't know what else to say. Like, he doesn't have the words yet to articulate this new experience that he has of living in a new place, and thinking about home and not knowing what's going on there. And so it's a poem about not having the speech codes yet for a historically new kind of experience. But my point in just pointing this out was that it's a very particular experience, that this is a Palestinian experience, and it's a very particular one. And the early poems, again and again, are kind of identifying in rural workers, in displaced people living outside of historical Palestine, that this is the kind of chorus that he's building up over the course of these poems. There's another line in that poem which I think is important, where he says, "To whom have I written these pages? What mail is there to take them?" And I think that this is a predicament, a dilemma that Darwish faces over and over again in his poetry. That is to say, where is my audience? Like, they live in the West Bank, they live in Gaza, some of them live in Israel, some of them live in Lebanon. Like, what kind of poetry could speak to all of these people? And what kind of poetry could possibly hope to represent all of these incredibly disparate kinds? They're all Palestinians. We're all Palestinians. But what kind of poetry could represent this community that's now living in displaced conditions all over the region? So the sender doesn't know his address, and the receivers don't necessarily have an address either. So this makes the possibility of being, a national poet, maybe if you're an American poet like Whitman, do I contradict myself? Very well, then I contradict myself. I contain multitudes, right? That kind of attitude, at least, it seems a little blasé to somebody who's in the historical predicament that Darwish is in, who also hopes to speak to a kind of collective emergency, I think. Now, one of the poems that we read, I think is a pretty striking for this week example of exactly what I'm talking about, which is the Athens airport poem. Because that poem is a collective and everybody's talking, right? I'll look on my screen, but you can maybe look on your pages. It's a poem which takes place in an airport, an international airport lounge. I think the background is very much the experience in 1982 of being expelled from Beirut and going to Athens with the rest of the PLO, but a number of other people too. And the poem says, Athens airport disperses us to other airports. And then there's a series of kind of questions about, where can I fight, asks the fighter. Where can I deliver your child, a pregnant woman shouts back. Where can I invest my money, asks the officer. That's none of my business, the intellectual says. A woman in our group says, my village is the bundle on my back. We have waited in Athens airport for years. A young man marries a girl. They've been there so long that marriages are taking place. But they have no place for their wedding night. He asks, where can I make love to her? We laugh and say, this is not the right time for that question. And the irony of the poem has to do with this disconnect between what these people are, the identities that they have, and the questions that they're asking, and the place that they're in, which is this limbo, which is this, it's kind of like the context of no context. There's nothing going on there. They're just waiting. They're not in a place that where any of these identities, being a fighter, getting married, being a banker, none of those identities mean anything all of a sudden. And neither do their questions mean anything all of a sudden. It's also important, I think, that Athens, you heard in the clip that Darwish talks about Euripides and Aeschylus. And he's quite a deep reader, and he has a poem about Sophocles too. He's quite a deep reader of Greek tragedy. And those of you who maybe you teach Aeschylus, you know that Athens is the place of the mythical origin of the court after this cycle of bloodletting in Aeschylus's trilogy, right? This is the problem, revenge leads to more revenge, and there's a kind of blood cycle. And the only thing that can stop it in the end is the creation of the Athenian court, and it happens in Athens. And so behind the poem too, there's that question, like what are you waiting for? Well, we're waiting for justice in this place where supposedly it was born, historically speaking. So there's that historical dimension to it as well. So this is one way, again, thinking about some of those early poems, that what he's doing is creating these kind of choral effects to suggest the outlines of a whole community. This is how I could speak. This is how I could make singular experiences universal experiences, or at least bigger than just one person. It's by actually inhabiting the subject positions of lots of different kinds of people. That's one way of doing it, but that's not the only kind of strategy that Darwish has. He has a lot of tools in his toolbox. And the other way I think of doing it, and this speaks more to the poems that we read, well, it speaks more to the Andalusian poem, I think, has to do with taking a kind of prophetic position, a poet-prophet position. So he's not necessarily speaking from inside of a collective in various places, but he's kind of announcing and dramatizing a whole history. So as Said notes in his note about this poem, and I'm going to ask you in a second, just like kind of what you made of the poem, because I know it's a hard poem. It's a long poem. It's not clear what's going on. And so I'm very, very curious just to know what people who are, you know, coming to it cold, so to speak, not entirely cold, because we've talked about Darwish at least for one class last week, but just what you made of it. So I'm going to ask you all to just chime in with any thoughts in a second. Before that, I just want to say something about the title of the poem, which Said says something about too, this 11 planets over the last scene of Andalusia. And I think that theatrical language of scene is important, because in some ways, especially in the first part of the poem, it's about Andalusia as a kind of stage, and some actors come on stage and then they come off stage, and other actors come on stage and they inhabit this place. But the other reference, as Said says, is to a surah, the surah of Yusuf, the story of Joseph in the Quran, where Joseph says to his father, and this is a kind of announcement that he is indeed a prophet, that Joseph is, and in the Quran he is a prophet, but he has a dream, and in the dream he sees 11 planets and the sun and the moon kneeling to me. That's what he says to his father. I just want to play a minute and a half of a sung version of this poem by a musician that I mentioned last week, whose name is Marcel Khalifa. Marcel Khalifa is the most famous oudist, a player of the oud in probably the world. If you think you might like it, I encourage you to look him up. It's beautiful music to my mind, incredibly sophisticated and lyrical and moving. And one of his texts often were poems by Darwish. So I think he put to music sort of 5 or 6 of Darwish's poems. And I think actually one of the most beautiful ones is this poem, Ana Yusufun ya Abi, which does say, I am Yusuf, oh my father. When he announces finally himself, you know, he's in Egypt, and he finally reveals himself to his father. And the Quranic story is in large part the same as the Old Testament story. And here is the poem itself. And you can read it. I'm going to play, and I'm just going to play a minute and a half. And I think that this is important. I've always found that it's important in the classroom. And you all know better than me that when one is talking about poetry from a context that, you know, students don't necessarily know much about, that the more kind of wide-ranging materials one can bring, the better. Just to have a sense of like the way that poetry in this poem fit into a whole world. And it's not just poetry on the page. It's performances of poetry. It's a certain kind of song tradition. And so it's always, you know, listening to a minute and a half will feel unsatisfying in some ways, but in other ways, I think you'll like it. So this is the first minute and a half of Marcel Khalifa's. So I'm sorry to stop that. I could listen to it all afternoon. One thing just to say about the poem itself, it's one of these poems where Darwish again takes on a very a tone and a diction and a speaker, because here again, this is a dramatic monologue. You know, it's not Darwish, it's Yusuf. He's coming out of a particular story, and he's a boy, right? And he speaks very simply. My brothers, in fact, the translation is probably too fancy. My brothers neither love me nor want me in their midst. But it says something like, my brothers don't love me and they don't want me around. They throw stones at me. They say mean things about me. They want me to die so that they can say nice things at my funeral. They shut the door on me so that, and then left me outside. And I mean, I think the obvious thing, especially if one's thinking about, oh, this is a poem by Mahmoud Darwish, he must be talking about, you know, this is a poem about people throwing stones at him and enmity, and must be about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or something like that. I think this is clearly a poem not about that conflict. It's clearly a poem about Arabs. Arabs are the ones that have let Palestinians down in this poem. They're the ones who have sought to expel him. And they're the older brothers that have not helped. So, which is just to say, context is important and complexifying. And so when you think you know, well, there's a Palestinian poet and he's talking about situations of conflict over and over again in Darwish's he makes this point that, yeah, okay, we are in a situation of antagonism with Israelis, but it's also the outside that is refusing to help us. And that is indeed what is going on in Identity Card, right? I'm an Arab. That's not just being said to the Israeli checkpoint guard. That's being said, as Darwish himself says historically, to all those outside, right? All those who are not in this immediate situation of, I'm an Arab too. I, as a Palestinian, am an Arab too. We should be having a relationship of solidarity here, but over and over again, you've done nothing for us. That's a kind of brutal summary of the sentiment in some of these poems. So Yusuf is a prophet, though, and he has this dream of planets and the sun and the moon. Even though he's a very he speaks in very simple terms, he's a prophet. And I think that it's important to think about this prophetic voice when we get to the Andalusian poem. So let me now ask you, since you did read it, it's a long poem, it's a hard poem, just anything, you know, moments that struck out at you, words that kept repeating over and over again that you wondered about, episodes that you thought were especially interesting or puzzling, anything that struck you. I'm really just, I really am curious to hear what your first impressions of this poem are. And of course, if you have more than first impressions, if you have elaborate thoughts about it, that's great too. So who will say something about what their experience of reading this poem was?
Yeah, I can, can you guys hear me okay?
Go ahead.
Yeah, so before I get to that, I want to talk about the other one you mentioned about Yusuf, with like the Arabs kind of selling out the Palestinians. I think that's really interesting because you mentioned how Darwish was, kicked out of Lebanon when the Israelis invaded, or they were kicked out. You said they ended up in Tunisia, right? But before they were in Lebanon, they were in Jordan, right? And they were expelled by the Jordanian monarchy because they saw them as like a state within a state. They saw them as like a dangerous entity. So I think it's interesting what you're saying. I think a lot of people don't understand how complicated it is. I think it's just the Jews and the Palestinians, but the Jordanians were the ones who expelled the Palestinians from Jordan because they saw them as a danger, as a state within a state. And then that's one thing. And the second thing I want to say is like just
well,
about,
yeah, and just let me,
go ahead.
with apologies for interrupting. I think that's very clearly, I mean, I think that, you know, Darwish might say, well, this is not an allegorical poem, but you named me Yusuf, talking to his father, and they threw me into the well, that is to say his brothers. This is the story. They threw me into the well, and they said the wolf was the one who killed them, right? The bloodstained shirt, here's those bloodstained shirt, the wolf got him. The wolf is more merciful than my brothers.
Right. Right. And I was just going to add, like, it's just right now, you think of the deal that Israel made, the Abraham Accords with the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. They basically, those Gulf countries have shown that they care more about their economic relationship with Israel and having Israeli tourists come in and economic ties than they do about the Palestinians. They basically thrown them under the bus. I mean, it's hard. It's pretty amazing to me because you wouldn't have seen anything like that. It used to be this like cause celeb, like at least that's what I thought. Like all the Arab countries, for the most part, you're like you have to stand behind the Palestinians, or the underdog, the oppressed by Israel. But now it seems that a lot of those Gulf countries and Saudi Arabia, et cetera, have made the strategic decision that, you know, it's better to back Israel in our war against Iran. They're more concerned with Iran, the Shiite crescent, than they are about the Palestinians. I know it's a little bit of a digression from the poetry, but to me, I think sometimes it's important because, you know, a lot of us teach social studies also, and if the kids just look at the poems in a vacuum and don't think about the history and the politics, they can miss out on a lot.
I think that's true. They will miss out on a lot. But let me get back to the question of the Andalusian poem, and ask again for some thoughts about having read that poem. Jim, do you want to just say it out loud so we can hear your voice?
Well, just that it feels, I felt like it was full of ghosts. It feels really haunted. It feels like the time is not solid, that the place isn't, it feels, I like the fact that I keep saying it feels, because I think that's what his goal is here, is I want you to understand the territory my heart is in right now. And even while he is an intellectual and he's coping with it through language, I think his real quest here is you don't understand it unless you feel what I feel.
Thank you, and I love what you say about kind of the transitory state, and I think that let's keep that in mind and come back to it. That sense of, I mean, of course, in one sense, it has a very strong setting. The poem, Andalusia, is evoked in any number of very sensual kind of ways, right? Pistachios and carpets and certain kinds of texts and certain architecture. But it also feels like, in the way that, you know, a stage set feels, that it can come down at any moment. It can come down and it can be brought back up. It's transitory in that way, that the people come on and off stage, the set can be brought down even and brought back up again. So I think that's, I think transitoriness, and of course that's the theme of the Athens airport poem too, right? Like how this is supposed to be a state that doesn't last very long. We're in the international lounge of an airport, right? We're not, you know, you're not meant to live here. This isn't a place for living. That's why all of our questions make no sense. This isn't a place to live. We're in a transitory state. So I think, and this is something that Darwish writes over and over about, is about living in limbo. Like how does one make a life out of a place that is meant to be passed through and not dwelt on? Liana, what were you gonna say?
In the first part, at the end, where he says, later we look up what was recorded in our history about yours in faraway lands, then we'll ask ourselves, was Andalusia here or there on earth or only in poems? It reminded me of what you said last week about Palestine has no official archives. And so poetry is the unofficial history. and it makes me feel and remind me, Andalusia is a memory that only lives on in history and people's poems. And is he saying that's what's going to happen to Palestine? That one day we will be then talking about Palestine as we speak about Andalusia. And in the second, he speaks about singing about Granada in song, and it made me again think of, is this what he fears? That it's going to be a song that people will sing and remember in poetry later.
Yeah, that there's a real ambiguity or ambivalence on his part about the powers of poetry, but there are also limitations to poetry, right? If poetry is the place where things get recorded, that has one kind of power, that has one kind of effect. Or if you can live in the poem in some sense, there are a number of passages where this is a common pun actually in this poem and many other poems, that the word for home, which is bait in Arabic, is also the word for a poetic meter. And there's a sense in which one living in a bait, in Darwish's poem in particular, has this sense of like, what if the poem is the only place we can live? Poetry has real power, but it's not official. It's not recognized necessarily by others. There's a real worry about that. Like if poetry is where history is written, that shouldn't be taken as like kind of in a complacent sort of way, because that's not a satisfying solution to this problem. Bianca and then Zachary.
For me, what I found so interesting about the poem in general is all the different parallels he draws with like historical figures, histories, in addition to different writers and different like historical pieces of literature throughout the entire poem, right? I think the interesting part about the fact that he continuously mentioned Andalusia is like the actual history of Andalusia and how it was actually taken over by the by the Spaniards and the Christians, and how that kind of downfall of that Islamic heritage that was there during that point kind of fell through, right? And how essentially just became a story. And to be honest with you, before really diving deep into the poem, I didn't really know much about Andalusia's history. So if it's from thinking about me and combination of how this could be a parallel to Palestinian history at this point, is he is really asking, like, is it just going to be a story? Like, is it just going to be something that like eventually is a story that people don't really read into and that people forget? And so that to see those parallels stressed out throughout the poem itself was just really interesting to me, how he intertwined it. And he did it so beautifully, right? Like you really had to kind of like read through it slowly and go back and reread to make sure you were understanding the parallels he was drawing.
Yeah, no, that's very well said. Thank you for that. And there are lots of words that appear over and over. One of them is mirror. One of them is key. One of them is mirror. And there's a sense in which, and he says this specifically a number of times, that Andalusia is a kind of mirror for Palestine, or a mirror for me, but that the mirror also is connected to water. There's a sense that, the looking into the water is also kind of looking into a mirror. The sense in which it's not like, this is when you look into water and the water just keeps going. That is to say, you don't get a confirmation of your identity by looking into this mirror in particular. You get a blurring of one's identity because the water is always rushing by. And I think that mirror is also a way of him saying, that Palestinian history and its fate, its modern fate, is an analogy, a mirror. I think that's one way of translating mirror, is to say analogy or metaphor, or something that's that carries another thing across. That Palestinian history or that Andalusian history is a metaphor for Palestinian history. That is to say that it could be, as you are all suggesting, I think, and as at various points in the poem, he says when he calls himself an atom of two Edens, and he lost both of them, right? He lost the Andalusian one as a poet, and he lost the Palestinian one as a poet too. And this question of return, I think we could come back to. I think that that's an important question too, whether or not one can go back to, whether or not one would want to go back to Cordoba. So sorry, Zachary and then Marianne.
I am. I'm unmuted. I just really love the metaphor of Andalusia, because Andalusia does still exist. It's just it's the southern province of Spain today, but it's completely different than the Andalusia of the Muslim Andalusia. And so there's these two, it's still there kind of, but it's been transformed into something that's almost something different. It's got the same, it's smaller, it's Christian, it's a totally different place, although I think it has a fairly big Muslim minority today. It's
from Morocco, yeah.
Right, but that Palestine still somewhat exists today, but it's in such a very different form. And maybe in that sense, all states are transient.
I think that's very much one of the implications of the first part of the poem in particular, right? I think that one of the tricky things, but wonderful and worth, talking about with yourself and with other readers of the poem and with students, is to figure out what is the tone of that first passage, in which exactly evokes the experience that you're talking about, Zachary. That is to say, of transitoriness, right? We're leaving. He's speaking in the voice, the collective voice of the Moors who are being expelled from the Iberian Peninsula. But it's not like a voice that's seeking revenge. It's not a voice that's even it's not a voice of anger, but what is actually the tone of that opening passage? It's very hard. It's kind of a quicksilver substance itself. It's both mournful, it's lyrical, it's a lot of different things, I think, but it's tricky to pin down. And it has to do, I think, with that experience that a lot of you have been evoking, starting with Jim, of transitoriness. We both are sad to be leaving, but know that this is what happens in history, right? One group comes in and another group has to leave. That's happened on the other side of the ocean, and it's happening here. And one is sad and it is violent, right? There are all sorts of scenes of violence here as well. So, and it's not that there is no anger. There's especially anger directed at the last king, the king who looks back, which a lot of people, as Edward Said notes, thinks is a kind of figure for Arafat himself. And this is Darwish saying, don't you be Arafat in this Madrid conference prior to Oslo, being like the last king of Andalusia, that is in looking back in melancholy regret at the thing that you're leaving. So we can read it out loud. I think we should. I think it'd be nice to read that first passage. But before we do, there's still a couple of hands, Marian and then Robert.
Sure. So I'm just aware of a couple things in terms of the medieval history that it seems to reference in terms of, I'm just thinking a lot about Tariq bin Zayed, and I'm probably not pronouncing that correctly, but I was very aware of so many parallels to the history of being the conqueror and being conquered, and in terms of, I think it was the fourth section when it says, I no longer look behind me for fear I'll remember passing over this land. I'm just thinking of that fable or history of Tariq standing on the Rock of Gibraltar saying, burn the ships, we're not going back, we will conquer, and going forth into the Iberian Peninsula and really just taking over. And so I was very aware of medieval history as I was reading through this poem, but then I was also aware of some connections to Rumi, because there are several poems for Rumi where he mentions mirrors all the time, and just about, in terms of saying things like I actually just taught my fifth graders a Rumi poem the other day, and they loved it, and it was all about mirrors. It was about letting go of the face of a mirror that contains no images. And I thought about that a lot as I saw that word mirror continue to be repeated throughout this poem. And I was thinking to myself, what is being reflected or not reflected in his mirror.
Yeah, it's difficult to remember my face in mirrors, he says. I was not a lover to believe waters are mirrors. I was not a narcissist, still I defend my image in mirrors. Yeah, there are a lot of that. And you're right. And there's the collar of the dove, which is a famous manual of erotic lore, I guess. And that's not quite right. It's more of a kind of Platonic philosophical reflection on the nature of erotic experience. It's an Andalusian writer, Ibn Hazm, who wrote it. There's a very strong, I agree, kind of that this is a real place, and yet it's also a place that is past. So there's that elegiac. I think one way of thinking about this poem actually is the elegy is a species of poetry which is said to the deceased. But interestingly, in the Arabic tradition and the medieval Arabic tradition, the classical tradition, which also has a genre called the elegy, it's a very central genre to the poetry, and is mostly, as with our elegies, given about people, a loved one, sometimes a king or a caliph. But there's also a very important genre of poems in Arabic called the Ritha al-Mudun, which is an elegy for cities. So that when cities are destroyed, when Baghdad or Damascus are sacked, the poet remembers when these cities seemed to be verdant and blossoming and gardens, and then looks on the present scene of destruction. So they're often kind of composed in the aftermath of a war. And not surprisingly, in Andalusia, during the Reconquista and then afterwards, this genre was very, very present in Arabic poetry as the Arab cities, one by one, fell to the Christians. And so there are many, many elegies for cities, for Cordoba, for Toledo, for Granada. And that's one way I think also of thinking about this city, that this poem, that it's an elegy for this civilization that lives on briefly in the space of the poem itself, but is not a permanent. It's not a permanent kind of existence. It lives like that water, right? It flows in and out. You can see your reflection in it. You can identify that this was a place maybe that you belonged, but the water keeps flowing and history keeps moving. Robert?
Sorry, I don't know if everyone saw, I put a poem in the chat. Can you guys see that or no? What I like to do in my classes, I always like to draw parallels, right? Because this is a poem, you're talking about Andalusia. This is written in 1503. I don't know if you're familiar with the professor, by Judah Abravanel. And it's very similar to me, the poem that we're reading about Andalusia, because the Jews were also expelled in 1492, the Sephardic diaspora. And his son fled to Portugal, which was a temporary refuge, right? And then the son was forced to convert, to baptism, to Catholicism, to Christianity. But if you read some of the lines, all about the longing, the homelessness, the elegy, like you just said, it's elegy. I think it's interesting because you were talking about the Palestinians being homeless and never having a home, or being the losers of history. But I think in the long, bigger picture, I think it's interesting because the Jews have had a very similar experience. They were also part of that Andalusia civilization, and they wrote poetry in Arabic, as I'm sure you're incredibly familiar with. And I think this is a really interesting contrast, this poem that I put in the chat, because you really see he's writing to his son, Isaac, and he has the same kind of angst and longing. And look at the last line, my line's going to be exterminated. He thinks that they won't exist anymore. And the Sephardic Jews go to Turkey, and they go to Greece, and they go to Morocco and Tunisia. And I think it's very similar to the Palestinians today that are spread out, diaspora, dispersed everywhere. So I think it's just interesting to think about that.
No, absolutely. And I think that that's a very important aspect to both the myth and the actual history of Andalusia. And it's the reason why Darwish turns to it, is precisely because it is the origins of a very important Jewish diaspora, as well as an Arab diaspora. That is to say, again, and you know, in the clip that we saw from the Godal film, the Israeli interviewer says, "You sound like a Jew," and he says, "I hope so. That would be great. I mean, that's a compliment, right? Because that would be the basis for some kind of historical conversation. That is to say, what we have in common is a history of defeat."
But the problem is, I think, is that that's not what is usually taught, right? I don't think in the Palestinian or the Arab world, unfortunately, I don't think that they're taught about the long history of Jews being expelled or being homeless, or, you know, you talked about like the temporary, the transient nature of the airport in Athens. It reminds me of the transient nature of Jews in DP camps and displaced person camps in Austria. They're probably asking the same questions, like, how am I going to sleep with my wife? How am I going to be a banker? How am I going to? So it's very similar to me, but I think that's part of the problem, is that I don't think everyone's learning about the other side. I think if you just look at these poems and you bring them into your classroom, you don't give that whole history, you can walk away from it thinking just that basically that, like what you were saying, that it's just one side. I mean, the Jews have been homeless for 2,000 years. So I think it's interesting for the class to think about that. You know, I'm taking away from his beautiful poetry and the real predicament that Palestinians are in. It's terrible, and Sovereign Shatila and Nakba, all of this, it's horrible. But I just think it's important. If you just look at these poems by themselves and don't show the history, I think kids can walk away with it thinking in a very one-sided perspective.
No, I fully agree that I think that history is important to teach with poetry. Frankly, I mean, I think that I've said that, and I think that it is one of the things that's taken me a long time to realize in the classroom, actually, that poetry is a wonderful thing for the classroom because it gives you a small text that everybody can read together, that you can read out loud, and you can talk about in small amounts. And but it can also be deceptive, as if the world can be reduced to just this page for the moment. And poetry doesn't exist just on the page or in the space of a classroom. And that's not a bad thing for students to learn. To think that poetry is connected to song, that it is connected to history, that it is connected to violence, that it's connected to power relations, that it's connected to identity. I think to resist that feeling that the poem is a discrete kind of object in the classroom, and to make it multidimensional, to make it a three-dimensional experience, is part of what, and it's hard to do. Even in this class, I keep on saying we're going to go and read that first part of the poem, right? But it's hard to talk about both history and the text. It's very hard to do. I know that it's hard to do in the classroom. You want to give, like, what's the right amount of context? Or how much do you have to know about the poet? How much do you have to have the history in which it was written, the moment that it was written? I think one's never going to get it right. Each class is a kind of performance too. One's never going to get it right. But I think it's better to give an expansive notion of what poetry could be, all the directions that it can take students, rather than again, reducing it to this page. I do want to mention, because this is maybe a really great resource that Robert's comment reminds me of, actually, which is this. Sorry, I gave Faute de Mieux the Amazon link. I should have given another link, but this was the one that occurred to me. But there's a wonderful, wonderful anthology of Andalusian, not just Andalusian, but other poems too, of poetry written in Hebrew, Arabic, mostly Hebrew and Arabic. It's called The Dream of the Poem, which is a line from Darwish, actually, in the poem that you read. The dream of the poem, whether or not Andalusia really exists in the poem, or whether it exists here on Earth, right? Is it a real thing, or is it just something that exists in the poem, a dream in that sense? And in this volume, which happens to be translated by a colleague of mine at Yale, who's a just absolutely brilliant translator named Peter Cole, translator from the Arabic and from the Hebrew. He translates poetry from this period, and it's very, very true that if you read through this anthology, you'll see that Hebrew poets, some of Jewish poets, some of whom wrote in Arabic and then others wrote in Hebrew, that their poems about, some of them are about Zion, are very, very similar to city elegies, to poems of longing for a lost paradise. So this is again just to say, to remind us all that that is, I think, Darwish's notion of exile and the opportunities. I think he never in the poems forgets that it is a very painful position to be in. It's not one that anybody wants to be in, but that he finds himself in for historical reasons. And then what does one do as a poet? And his point is, well, one looks for moments and historical episodes that provide us with ways of thinking about solidarity with the losers, with the Troys, with the Trojans, right? Over and over again, that this is that defeat has its own opportunities too. They're not ones that you would choose to give oneself. They're not ones that you would choose to have. But it's also important in situations of emergency to be able to reflect in that way too. And I think that that's we're coming to the end of class, but that really is one of the amazing things to me about reading Darwish and his poems, is to think about the circumstances, as I've been saying over and over again, the circumstances that they're written in, and the amazing range of reference and sentiment that even in these incredibly reduced circumstances in some ways, right? Not being able to live where you want, not having a real community that belongs in a place, that he's able to conjure these visions of vast movements of historical peoples, but also very, very intimate scenes, sensual scenes of eating and sleeping and dreaming. That range of human experience and intellectual experience is what makes, you know, him as a poet very attractive to me. And I think that it can be made because he's written so many good early short poems as well as great historical poems, that I think it's always been my experience when I teach Arabic literature that Darwish is somebody that students seize on, and they surprise themselves by finding so many moments that they respond to, not knowing anything about Arabic literature, not knowing necessarily anything about Israel or Palestine, that they find themselves solicited, interpolated inside these apparently very strange kinds of poems. So, I think that that is ultimately what one wants to convey in a classroom, right? That sometimes the strange is very familiar, and sometimes what seems very familiar and what you thought you knew, you really didn't know at all. I know this 5:15, and I know that the sun is still shining, and I feel like everybody who needs to, I don't know what the protocol here is but I'm happy to keep talking with anybody who wants to hang around. Maybe Sam or anybody can fill me in on what happens next.
I think that's totally fine. We will have a teacher section next week where the teachers will have a chance to all reflect together on what we learned today. But I would say if you need to drop, you can drop. And if Robyn, if you don't mind sticking around a little bit longer, whoever would like to stay can stay.
Yeah, of course.
Okay.
I'm happy to stick around. I won't feel bad if you don't stick around. Well, Ilan, you had your hand up there. You want to chime in?
Yeah. I mean, just since we're offering, thank you for these past two classes. It's really fascinating, and I'm really grateful to have been able to read and think through Darwish. I just, I'm curious about both the poem, the Andalusian poem, and our discussion of it recently is a bit puzzling for me, and it's a bit hard for me to wrap my head around the ways that I see Darwish kind of speaking about community as, you know, flowing and as changing. And there's even some language about, you know, the compost of cultures, which has this connotation of new life and birth, even he refers to as this like next phase of exile. And then discussion we're having of very much like, oh, there's exile on both sides, and like this is part of what happens in history, in the Grande Durée. I'm having trouble reconciling that with what feels to be like a much, I mean, both to me personally, and also even to Darwish, like a much more particular situation of injustice and of struggle, right? And I'm thinking back to Identity Card, and I'm thinking back to, oh, I pulled it up, where'd it go? I mean, you all know the lines to which I'm referring, you know, beware of my hunger and my anger, right? Like it doesn't seem like he is resigned to any type of like, oh, well, that's what happens, you know, people's come and go and get forced into exile. And certainly, you know, if we think about in 2021, Palestinians are not resigned to, oh, you know, we lose our homelands and get forced into exile. And so, you know, I understand there's some 30 years in between Identity Card and Andalusia, but I'm just curious, like, you know, what your thoughts are on that tension, and the extent to which his thinking has changed about this, like, I don't know, the defeat or the exile.
I think that's a great question. It's really well put, and I do think that part of an approach to the answer has to do with Darwish's own development and career. That is to say, as a poet who begins in the 1960s writing as an Arab living in Israel, and living under house arrest, and being, you know, I think confronted with a situation of, you know, living under military rule for many years, under emergency regulations, and that there's a kind of daily assault that is recorded in the poetry, and that the later poems, he leaves Israel, Palestine in 1970, and comes back to Ramallah after the Oslo Accords. But that the later poetry really records this experience, a different experience. And Darwish was was criticized painfully to him by poets and intellectuals who decided that they were going to remain in Israel after 1948. Amir Habibi is one, Sami al-Qasim is another, who remained kind of colleagues of Darwish, but there were real disagreements over whether or not that was politically, personally, in every way, ethically, the right thing to do. But I do think that it's, and he said so at the time, that I think that this will give me my poetry will gain some opportunities by living away from this kind of situation of daily assault, of being under house arrest, right? That it'll open up my poetry to certain kinds of other poetic experiences, human experiences, Arab experiences, but also it'll close down other kinds of poems. So he doesn't write that kind of poem anymore, that kind of poem that feels very in touch with, I think, quotidian life in Israel in the 1960s. But the horizons of his poetry become extraordinarily broad. His reading as I mentioned in the article, which is very restricted, the number of books that he could have even read, especially in Arabic, in the 1960s in Israel, was incredibly limited. But abroad, in Beirut, in Cairo, he can read world literature. So there's a sacrifice. I think that he's very conscious of that. It's not a choice that he ever lets go of thinking about and worrying over and wondering whether or not he kind of did the right thing, whether or not, he very famously, the one of these writers that I mentioned, Habibi, who, again, if you're looking for reading lists, things for your reading list, he has a book called The Pesoptimist, which is one of the great works of Palestinian literature. I think it's quite difficult, maybe not right for a classroom, but I think that you enjoyed it. And Emil Habibi stayed in Haifa, and he was a novelist. I think one of the great novelists in Arabic. And on his tombstone, that's what it says. He stayed in Haifa. And I think that the fact that there were Palestinian intellectuals who stayed, and he was not one of them, was created, feelings of guilt, but they weren't paralyzing feelings of guilt, right? So I think you're right. I think that there is a real tension there, but it's an interesting one to read about, and I think that one has to also be alive to the advantages, I think, that he drew from leaving. Bianca?
I think what's quite interesting about him in reality is that within his poetry, you could see the duality of his like persona, right? This constant battle or contrast between the idea that why he had to leave and why he would have wanted to stay or could have stayed, right? But in the end, even though his poetry from the beginning to the end is quite different, the message always is the same, right? It's always this idea of like resist what is happening to you, but don't stay quiet about it, right? Like he adds all these historical connections in the later poems to really show what happens if you stay quiet, what happens if you don't speak about what's going on. And I think that for me really shows that even though he was dealing with this internal struggle, he didn't let the internal struggle keep him quiet, right? Like he got all this backlash for leaving, but at the end of the day, he was still fighting for the cause. And you could see that throughout all his poems. And that for me really shows that he never gave up, even if people did believe that he had.
Yeah, I think it's one of the things that he talks about, that's also very well put, that he talks about a lot in his writings and his interviews, the ways in which he's clearly very moved and proud that although his poetry becomes something different, he was an incredibly famous poet as a young man. It didn't hurt that he was incredibly handsome, but he was famous for a particular reason, like a particular kind of poem, which was the early poems that you read, which I think are too often read as if they're just simple, like they're just like declarations of identity or something like that. I don't think that's at all what's going on. I think they're very, very sophisticated, but not in a verb, not necessarily in a kind of verbal way. It's not that the language or the lexicon that he uses is so elaborate or baroque, or that's not where the intelligence is. The intelligence is, pinpointing these situations where like this is what it means to be a Palestinian living under military occupation at the moment. Like this will give you some sense of it. This is what it sounds like to speak to that experience. I think that's the drama of those poems. And then the later poems are something, very, very different. They're very, very different. And yet, and this is what he was always very, I think, grateful for to the public and also proud about, was that he maintained his audience. And in fact, his audience in the West Bank, in Israel proper, in Gaza and in Palestinian communities all over, really always was growing. I mean, he became more and more of a powerful presence, intellectual presence, actually having left. So I think that's absolutely true that, and that was his point. That was his point about leaving, actually, was that it would give him, it would take him away from certain experiences, but it would give him the ability to speak to wider audiences that would include, he wanted, he hoped, his early, more localized kinds of audiences. And that's why he left. And I think that he was a successful poet in that sense, that he brought people along with him, even as he changed his style and his approach and his themes constantly. That's an amazing thing about him. I mean, he actually died quite young. He was, in his late 60s or something, and he had 20 books of poems, and each one was quite different from the last. And that's no easy trick to keep renewing one's own style and interest. And he did it in part by he always read. He read other poets. He read into history. He listened to Native American chants. He was very, very curious about other people. Yeah. There's a very, very interesting history. I'm reading Bianca's comment about the Oslo Accords.
Yeah, you mentioned that he was against that, right? And that's part of the reason he didn't like Arafat. And he said Arafat said, and I read in the Said piece, I think it was that Arafat said the Palestinians were an ungrateful people, and he said get another people. Then why was he against that? I understand he wasn't going to give them back Haifa and like the places on the coast, but the Israelis weren't getting everything they wanted either, right? It was just kind of like give and take. That was the whole point. And they, it was hard for Yitzhak Rabin to shake hands with Arafat. It was hard on, but Rabin had to deal with all these right-wing settlers who eventually, killed him, and he had extremists on his side too. Why was Darwish against it? What was the reason?
He wasn't as forthright about his reasons as Said was. Said, who published a very, very long piece in the London Review of Books, kind of in the weeks that followed the Oslo Accord, that called Arafat basically, literally, like a used car salesman. And this was Arafat, who Said had supported in the United States, where Arafat was viewed as a terrorist. And Said had supported him for a very long time, and he turned on him on the question of the Oslo Accords very severely. And Darwish was never as public about his reasons for criticizing it. But in general, he seems to have thought, like Said did, that politically speaking, what happened in the Oslo Accords was that Arafat agreed to become the security service that Israel no longer would have to have in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and that this was that as far as for somebody who had supported the PLO and Arafat for many years as a national liberation organization, there was no reason to support them anymore. It was no longer a Palestinian liberation organization. It has become a security service. It's 5:30. I noticed people dropping out. My kids are home too, knocking at the door. This has been really great. I hope it was at least a little bit useful for you. And again, if you want to get in touch, if you want to get in touch with me, I'm easy to find because I'm on the Yale website, and you can email me directly. But I'm also happy to know if you want any of the things that I talked about, or resources or other ideas too. I'm totally willing and able and happy to field those kinds of questions. So this has been really great for me. I've to talk to teachers in New York. It's been wonderful. So thank you all.